My name is Bruce Lawrence. I'm a professor of Islamic Studies. I'm now emeritus, but for 40 years I taught the field of both Islam and Tasawwuf, or Sufism, and also with regard to South Asia, that is Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, but also Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Southern Philippines. I taught courses at Duke University relating to all of these topics. And I've had the privilege of knowing Jamal Hoja for, I guess, more than 15 years now. I think when she first came to America and to North Carolina, Janguzel Zulfikar was then at UNC, and the two universities, most people think of them as rivals, competitors, but I would say that it's a friendly rivalry and it's a complementary competition, because we both University of North Carolina and Duke are trying to raise the level of awareness and also to improve the education that people have about Sufism and also about Islam and Muslim societies. So I'm very lucky that one of my friends for decades has been Carl Ernst, Professor Carl Ernst at UNC, and one of my students at Duke, who also became a colleague more recently, was Umid Safi. And I've had the privilege of maybe training 15 people who've been doing their PhD, their dissertation under my direction at Duke University, but also because Carl Ernst is such a close friend, and because UNC and Duke cooperate, we've had many overlapping students, so that some of the students whom he has trained, I have also sat on their committees and I've also contributed to their knowledge. And for instance, in terms of Tasawwuf, one of the students who came to study with me was Pir Zia Inayat Khan, whom I had met through his father, Pir Vilayat Khan. And when he came to study with me back in the 90s, I said, oh, you must also take courses with Professor Ernst. And so he did, and I think we certainly benefited from having him. It's very rare for people who teach Sufism to have a living Pir or Murshid as a student. And he did not need to study with us to learn about his qualities as a teacher or as a Muslim. But in terms of the history of Sufism, I think he learned some things from us, and we learned much from him. So that's my general background, and what has been really so wonderful about my acquaintance and now long-term friendship with Jamal Hoja is that I was interested that, first of all, there would be a female who would be at the forefront of a major Sufi order like the Kenan Rifai tariqa, and that she would project not only the history of it, but also her own interpretation and her own commitment to perceiving new ways to make the message of the Kenan Rifai tradition known to others. So I've been very, very pleased with this, but I would never have imagined, even with all the credit and all of the admiration I had for her, that she would not only project a strong face for Sufism in Turkey and, of course, in the United States, but that it would extend to China and now to Japan. So I must say that my admiration is tempered by my disbelief, not my disbelief in her, but my disbelief that she or anyone could accomplish this, to make a bridge, as it were, from Turkey first to Peking and China, now to Kyoto and Japan. So in general, I'm not only pleased, I am astonished and very grateful for what she has done in this regard. And I must say that when I think about this conference that we're just now finishing, the second day of this two-day conference that is taking place here in Kyoto with an institute that bears the name of the Kenan Rifai Institute for Sufi Studies, I'm aware of two or three things that I would like to say, two or three things that stood out for me. One is that I was very, very impressed with a number of Japanese students who are committed to the study of Sufism within the broader arc of Islam and Islamic studies, but also committed to learning languages which are obviously not Japanese, languages like Arabic, Persian, some also know Turkish, and some know Urdu, and some have traveled and spent time in various parts of the Muslim world. So I'm very impressed that they've not only had this fieldwork experience and this language training, but they've also learned English, and that they're able to present their findings, their research, their projects in the English language, and not just English language, but what I would call academic English. So they're speaking English, which is its own challenge, but then there's academic English, which I think is a further challenge, and it requires, it seems to me, two things. It requires the mechanical facility to know how to write or type or use a computer for doing English, and then the footnoting, all the schematics of academics. But there's also something more about, how would I describe it? About the tone, the affect, the performance, if I might say it, the performance of English. And it seems to me that is my second point, where there is still some advance, there still is some further progress that's needed on the part of these very admirable Japanese students, and also some of the professors from whom we've heard here, is that beyond the skills that they've mastered and beyond the contributions they made, there is still the bridge to what I would call the performance, if I can use that term, the performance of academic English. And by that I mean two things. I mean that what happens in America, and Professor Morris, James Morris, who is a colleague and friend of mine, described it today, it's the ability to say things in such a way that you capture detail, but you don't drown people in that detail. So you have a point, but then you put it in a structure, in a framework, where people who understand something about Islam, something about Muslim society, also about the history and the importance of Sufism, that they can gather your own individual work and then put it in a broader framework. And I think my second point is that beyond the work that's already been done, the further work that needs to be done is to project and to, if you will, to refine, to improve, to make more effort in producing academic performance of English, not mastery of English. I think mastery of English, the ability to use English, the ability to express oneself in English is very strong, I should say, among my Turkish colleagues and also among the Japanese students and colleagues I've met here. But I think what is needed, which is yet to happen, is to move from the skill to the performance. And I would hope that this further bridge, or this further addition can happen in the next 6 years. So my third point and final point, which I think is really the most astonishing thing I heard from Professor Tanada, is that all of the activities of his institute here exist in part because of Japanese government funding. So that they've had different, and he's gone through the trajectories of when they began. I think it was in 1997, and then the first period, the second period, third period. Now I think they're in the fourth period, which started last year, and it goes, I believe, from 2016 to 2022. So they have a period now of 6 years, and the 6-year period is supposed to move from having Sufism, Islamic studies in general, but Sufism in particular, related to humanities and social sciences, and now to relate it also to natural sciences. And I think that is a huge challenge. In other words, when I think about how I have studied and how I appreciate and project what is the core of Islamic learning and what is related to Sufism in that tradition, I'm very comfortable myself talking about both humanities, that is to say literature, poetry, religion, philosophy, art, and also social sciences. I've read a great deal in sociology, anthropology, psychology, all the different ways in which one thinks about subjects critically, using quantitative as well as qualitative methods. But to move any branch of study, but especially something such as Sufism, from humanities and social sciences into natural sciences, is to me not just an incremental leap. It's not just going 1 to 2 to 3, it's going 1 to 2 and then jumping to 3. And the reason I say jumping is because there are a couple different things that are, it seems to me, very tricky about natural sciences. One is the notion that science somehow is quantitative and measurable, and that if you can figure out enough systematic ways of tracing the genome, to give one thing that's very big, that one thinks of the genome now and people say, oh, of course, we know much more about how people inherit, how they project, what they do. But if I could take just one subject, which I hope this institute will address, is the relationship between Sufism and genome theory, or the relationship between the nefs and the genome. And the nefs is a very critical term in Sufism, but it refers not just to the self, but in some sense to the different levels of the self. If you will, it's kind of a spiritual genome. But I wonder how this institute will measure genome sciences as well as physics, as well as astrophysics. If I could think about the next 5 years from 2017 to 2022, I think there'll be huge developments in outer space, in the development of explorations in Mars and Venus and the Moon, and also perhaps even Saturn and Jupiter. When I think about how, when we talk in Islam about Allah Ta'ala, Rabb al-Alameen, the master of the universe, the creator of the heavens and earth, how do you relate the language of the Quran and of Islam and of course of Sufism to these new categories and these new frontiers of space? So I think the great challenge, if I can use two Sufi terms, it's both the qabz and the bast. It's both what is very small, it relates to something that's the tiniest element of the human being, the genome, that is the qabz, but then the bast, the thing that goes beyond the mind, that expands to outer space, is how does one think of the human and the human condition in relationship to these frontiers that science, astrosciences, astrophysics, space exploration is opening up. So I think it's a wonderful challenge. I would say that the greatest tension, in my humble view, the greatest tension will be how to organize all these parts in such a way that what is now the Japanese, if I can call this the Japanese element, or the Japanese niche, or the Japanese segment of the larger study of Sufism throughout the world, how it relates not just to something that comes from Japan, or where Japanese understand things that other people have done and can quote them, but how there's something in Japan and Japanese scholarship that adds to, that's incremental to what has been done in Turkey, and also in parts of Western Europe, in the UK, and also North America, and both Canada and the United States. So, and not to leave out Africa. So there's also the whole question of Africa, and I know many people who are devout Muslims and very skilled Sufi masters who are in Africa, how all these different parts, if I can call it, of the global community studying Sufism, how it relates to what happens in Japan and then the Kenan Rifai Center here in Kyoto. I think that the greatest need, if I can be very specific and very blunt, the greatest need is to have someone, perhaps working with Professor Tanaga, or somebody who he has yet to identify, who could be not just a mentor for these students, but a coordinator of these different cultural idioms. Because there's a different cultural idiom in Japan than there is in China, than there is in Turkey, and then there is in, let's say, Europe, Western Europe, or the United States. It's not just a matter of language, of Japanese or Turkish or Arabic or Persian or German or English. I think there's also the idiom of self-expression, a different role of adab. It's not just the adab of recognizing and reciprocating value for other human beings, which is the core of adab. But it's also understanding these differences between cultures that have everything to do with performance, with how you perform in different settings for different groups. And I would hope that this Kenan Rifai Institute here can think about performance, and because they're so good-willed and they're so creative and they're so committed for the next, at least for the next 5 to 6 years till 2022, that they could bridge not only the two Easts, but the many Easts and the many Wests in how they project this vision of Sufism, which Jamal Nur Khoja has made so vibrant and so attractive to so many people. So that's my hope, and I'm encouraged by what I've seen here in the last 2 days, and I would just hope that there will be not only sequel conferences, but even more than conferences, a kind of platform, a more general platform where the scholarship and the contributions of multiple persons, regardless of nationality, will be seen as a collective step forward.